is actually from the introduction. And also, Dr. Harris and I did a show maybe 2 or 3 months back about this book. So if you want to go back and listen to that, it's just the audio only podcast. So I like this version better because now people, if they have questions for him, you can ask him now. But in the introduction, Dr. Harris writes, "The Hunger Games isn't just the brutally honest name of the annual fight to the death competition organized by the Capitol, the city that dominates Panem. It's the way that its elite controls the districts, starvation, scarcity, and minimal rewards doled out to subservient districts. The Capitol uses hunger as a weapon against the masses. It's also a powerful metaphor for the economic system we live under today, so much so that the Hunger Games has now become shorthand for any especially brutally competitive environment or economy."
Stay Alive, and I didn't read the Hunger Games books, but I saw the movies when they came out. I thought they were very cool. Panem, you know, the name of the dystopia playing on Panem circuses, I thought that was very clever. I appreciate it. And you're right, it's a rich story. It's rich in terms of political resonance. I'm curious to what extent you think that they're telling a specific story about the United States, because Panem is a successor state to the US. It's a very American dystopia in a lot of ways. The tension between the capital and the districts, that plays into things like federalism, that plays into the relationship between the American metropolis, whether we're talking about kind of the metropolis in general, or New York, or Washington, D.C., and the hinterland, deindustrialization, things like that. And there are a lot of characteristics that are particular to the United States in terms of the trajectory of Panem. But in the book, you also tease out global lessons. You touch on leftist movements, protest movements all over the world. Your forward begins in Hong Kong, and the fact that there's going to be a theme park version of the Hunger Games in the PRC. So to what extent do you think that we've got a story about politics in general, or a universal trajectory, versus something that's specific to the United States?
I think it's you're the expert on pop culture, but you can see the resonance of it in the way that the Hunger Games, the symbols from the Hunger Games and some of the phrases and so on have been used in protests over the past few years in places like Hong Kong, here in Thailand, Myanmar. It's being used at the moment, the 3-finger salute of solidarity, Chile, Colombia. You know, clearly it's having a resonance, has had a resonance for young people across the world, albeit in very different cultural and political circumstances. But essentially what unites all of those movements is an anger at inequalities, a lack of hope, elite corruption, a sense of the immovability of political elites, disinformation, the sense of pressure on young people, that they're meant to perform in certain ways in our capitalist system, and with social media now on them as well. So clearly Suzanne Collins, the writer of the Hunger Games, you know, set the story in, as you say, a post-collapse United States. She didn't have to do that, and so she was addressing things she saw in American politics and culture, and I would say political economy as well. But it's also had a much broader resonance for young people feeling some of the same pressures, and I would say the same traumas in lots of countries around the world.
And I know Pascal had some questions for you as well.
Yeah, I had a question for Dr. Harris. One of the things, a common trait that we see on the left is a critique of film and culture in Hollywood through an analysis of how these types of cultural productions reify capitalism. What I find fascinating about your work is that you're taking obviously capitalist Hollywood productions and using their narratives to actually subvert the function of capitalism. How exactly do you go through that process to find those kind of themes that are most effective at kind of challenging the main overall functionality of capitalism in an actual capitalist product?
Well, this was one of the debates about the Hunger Games from the start, of course. You know, the criticism that, well, it's Hollywood again selling us rebeltainment. You know, this is very superficial, and obviously you can take these big popular culture stories in any ways you want. But the more, I surprised myself actually. The more I kind of looked into the story and the themes that were being addressed, I thought there's something here. There's a framework where we can talk about capitalism and collapse, in particular, crisis and collapse, which is something I want to talk more about. I mean, Mark Fisher, I quote in the book as saying, you know, in a way, we need to be like the rebels in the story. Once we've been offered up some of these symbols, even if we think they're superficial or just Hollywood kind of versions of revolutions, we can take some of these symbols and themes and run with them and appropriate them. And it's interesting how that echoes some of the story in particular the second and third books in the Hunger Games series, where it's very much about playing with symbols of revolution and propaganda and how in particular the organized revolution which emerges in the Hunger Games story, you know, is very conscious about using symbols in order to take the revolution to a fuller stage and eventually overturn the existing regime. So you know, I think we can get hung up on what the author actually intended and sometimes miss out on how these popular culture stories are a way into talking about politics and political economy and protest and revolution for audiences that they obviously resonate with. So let's, you know, I think kind of let's use them as best we can.
To hear the rest of this show and more, you can find us at This Is Revolution Podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, Podbean, Pandora, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, you can catch a new episode every Wednesday on the Zero Books YouTube channel. This is Revolution.